Greetings. My name is Natalia Fedruszczak, and I am Communications Director for Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, a Canadian charitable nonprofit organization. Welcome to our panel discussion today about the Культур-лігу with three leading experts on this important and unique movement, Miroslav Shkendry, Harriet Murav, and Gennady Estrach. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about UJE and the Lviv Book Forum. UJE was launched in 2008 with the goal of strengthening mutual comprehension and solidarity between Ukrainians and Jews, two peoples who have lived on the territory of modern-day Ukraine for over a millennium. Among our initiatives is the support of literary festivals. These fairs have offered participants the opportunity to engage in a broad interethnic dialogue by discussing publications supported by UJE, as well as those books that strengthen and affirm the values that we share. A principal partner for us is the Lviv International Book Forum, Ukraine's largest literary festival. For 8 years now, we've enjoyed exploring a wide range of books dedicated to the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship. Typically, this education has taken place in auditoriums large and small in the beautiful Western Ukrainian city of Lviv, designated as the UNESCO City of Literature and in the Ukrainian language. Last year, as many festivals and events moved online, we introduced an English language panel at the festival. This has allowed us to bring the Book Forum and UJE's program and ideas to a wider audience. Today's discussion will focus on a new English language book that is still in process about Культур-лігу. I'm honored to introduce the participants of this panel who are actively engaged in this new volume and really are very great minds on this subject. Dr. Miroslav Shkendry is Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba's Arts Faculty in German and Slavic Studies. He has published works on the cultural and political history of Ukraine, the avant-garde, nationalism, Ukrainian-Jewish relations, Ukrainian-Russian relations, and post-colonial theory. Dr. Shkendry was a jury member last year in the inaugural year of a new UJE initiative, Encounter, the Ukrainian Jewish Literary Prize. Dr. Harriet Murav is professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the program in Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In addition to studies of Dostoevsky and Russian law and literature, her new research is Archive of Violence, the Russian Civil Wars, and the Literature of Abandonment. Dr. Murav is editor of the Slavic Review. And Dr. Gennady Estrach is clinical professor at the Arts and Science Department at New York University. His fields of expertise are Jewish intellectual history, Yiddish language and literature, and Soviet Jewish history. It should be noted that Dr. Estrach was managing editor of the Yiddish literary journal Sovjetisch Heimland, Soviet Homeland, from 1988 to 1991. So, Культур-лігу was an incredibly important movement for advocates of Yiddish. But many people, and I'm sure many of our viewers, don't know what it is. And so I'd like to begin with a very basic question. What was Kультур-лігу and why was it important? And I think, Dr. Estrach, I would like to address that question to you. And if you could give us a short explanation of Kультур-лігу.
Thank you. So the Kультур-лігу was established in 1918, in the very beginning of 1918 in Kyiv. And the idea of the league was actually, it came from an attempt or various ideas about building a secular Jewish nation. And a secular Jewish nation, it was also one of the important parts of the project is what can be called as a substitution, to substitute religion with something else. And the something else was supposed to be the high culture. So it was important to create this high culture. It existed in some elements, but still it was in the making. And the Kультур-лігу actually used the opportunity of, or a couple of opportunities. First of all, that Kyiv was a well-established Jewish cultural center. Also, it had already an interesting group of Yiddish writers and other cultural activists. And the second, that the independence of Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine officially suggested Jewish autonomy in Ukraine. These two parts actually created, as the activists believe, the perfect formula for establishing such an organization. This organization existed. It is remarkable and actually even difficult to understand how it was possible against the backdrop of the Civil War to organize a successful network of various organizations, of various groups, of various affiliations in up to 100 Ukrainian places. The ideas of the Kультур-лігу were so appealing that in many places, organizations modeling on the Kультур-лігу were established. They existed in Paris, they existed in Amsterdam, they existed in Warsaw, in the Baltic countries, even there were attempts to establish it in Detroit, in New York, and so on. In some places, they survived till the beginning of the Second World War, and the places are Paris, the places are Warsaw, the places are Amsterdam. Shortly.
I mean, this is an interesting question because it's, and in part you've answered it because, you know, the three of you have penned really what I think is a brilliant introduction to this volume, which I hope, you know, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I am wondering really why is it that Kyiv and what is known as the territory of modern day Ukraine, what was it in its spirit that allowed Kультур-лігу to flourish? Because again, you mentioned a number of other cities, but what is it about this land that allowed that to happen? And I'm wondering maybe, Dr. Murav, if you would be able to address that question. What was so special about this particular place?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. It had been a place of Jewish aspiration from other regions in the former Pale of settlement. And there was, I think, already existing there a kind of multi-layered Jewish community with wealthier and less wealthy, less well-established, more well-established Jews. And as Gennady says, it was a literary center where you wanted to go if you had ambitions of being a writer. What made it that is probably again. I mean, even in the 19th century, plenty of Jews made their way to Kyiv, whether they really legally had permission to or not. So one of the writers that I'm interested in, and others are as well, it's Kipnis, who isn't part of our volume, lived in a small town, shtetl, around 120 miles north of Kyiv, Slavyeshna. And the minute he got noticed, I mean, to get noticed as a writer, you had to be in Kyiv. I mean, it was the place to be. Other writers as well, Hadia Mladovsky, for example, talks about her excitement at being invited to go visit Bergelsen, Oshta, and Kvitko in their circle. Kvitko also is another writer who's in our volume who made his way there and was welcomed. And I think wealth, the fact that there were Jews who were wealthy enough to help out other Jews, that there was a structure, a network of support. And don't forget, I mean, as Miroslav has written about in all his work and so wonderfully shown us, it was a kind of hotbed of cultural, literary experimentation, avant-garde in all the arts before Kultur and Liga and throughout the period. So David Borodjuk, Alexandra Exter, I mean, many other important figures were in Kyiv, as opposed to, say, Moscow was more or less not full of Jewish literary activity. St. Petersburg at this time, also not a kind of happening happening place. I don't feel like that's a very wonderful answer, but it's something.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I'm sitting in KU right now, and as I was reading the introduction and some other material on Kультур-лігу, I mean, for me, it's sort of, you walk the streets and you sort of think about these people who were here. And if we look at the volume that you're now working on, I'm wondering maybe, Dr. Shkandari, you could give us an idea of what the book will entail. And I would also then ask if each of you would sort of talk about your specific essays within this book and within that would provide a larger context for the understanding of Kультур-лігу. So perhaps, Dr. Shkandari, you could give us that framework.
Well, one of the interesting things about Kультур-лігу for me was the fact that although technically it sort of ceased to exist in 1920, aspects of the Kультур-лігу continued. So in Kiev, there was an art school that continued. There was a publishing arm, which also continued. Parts of the Kультур-лігу in different parts of Ukraine, had their own life. And the importance for me, or the amazing part of the story for me, is how multifaceted was the work they did. They left a legacy not only in literature of Yiddish, but also in the world of art, particularly and surprisingly perhaps in the avant-garde, modernism, avant-garde art, which is the work they produced in Kiev. It remains to this day highly admired, particularly the graphic art. But there's also music, about which we until now have known very little. So the articles in the collection focus on the culture, different aspects of the cultural production, but they also focus on education, on music, on art, on different aspects that have been underrepresented. And my own interest in this particular group came out of my study of the so-called cultural renaissance of the 1920s in Ukraine. As almost everybody now knows, this was an attempt to create a new, modern, urban Ukrainian culture, but also one that drew on a past, even looked for archetypes of past Ukrainian cultural production. And I was struck by the fact that the Kультур-лігу was doing something very similar. It was definitely determined to be new, to create a new culture, a modern culture, a culture that was, on a level with what was happening in other cultures in Europe. But it was also focused on being Jewish. And what does that mean? Well, for them, it meant looking at the past and drawing the best from the past, but also looking at the kind of graphic art, the kind of design, the kind of obsessions that Jewish people had in the past. And I found this parallel fascinating. So to me, it was amazing that in Kiev, both these groups, in their different cultural spheres, were doing something very similar, and were driven by a similar inspiration. And in fact, they had contacts, quite a lot of contacts between them. So that's where I came into this. And I think the volume tries to explore these different dimensions of the Kультур-лігу and its association to some degree with other people, other cultures in the city.
If Dr. Murabe, if I could ask you, because I believe that one of your essays is Lьвівський's poetry of abandonment. And I'm wondering if you could maybe discuss that some in terms of, who is in this individual, what is this poetry? And I was also struck by the fact that I was surprised to learn of the friendship between Fitko and then Pavlo Tychina, who was the Ukrainian poet, translator, activist, and how many points of contact within, let's say, that literary sphere of the Ukrainian and Jewish writers, how many points of contact and appreciation between these two groups and these two ethnic groups, did you find?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it's one of the motivations I had to be interested in Kyiv Kulturliga and its artists, because of the network of associations between Yiddish writers and visual artists, musicians, theater directors, and their Ukrainian counterparts. And so the thing that brings all of these figures and their work together for me in such an exciting way is this combination of, bombs are falling, our army might be attacking, the town that you lived in, or there might be insurgent groups. There's a war. There are many wars going on right now. We ought to do, let's start a literary, journal, a publishing house, an art center, a theater group. That's what we ought to do. I mean, to me, that's so incredible that people sitting around complaining that there's not enough food, that the power is limited, that bombs are falling, which Yiddish writers, of course, complained about like everyone else did. And at the same time, all right, let's publish this work and let's commission that, and let's look into the possibility of a new form of theater, and let's teach children who are refugees from violence music. I mean, where do we see that? To me, it is really kind of a miracle. If I were a refugee of violence, I don't think the first thing I would come up with is, I know, let's start a literary foundation. I find that very important and inspiring. This combination of incredible violence, political, social chaos, shortages, problems of every kind, and yet incredible literary creativity. And that goes for Ukrainian writers, artists, theater directors, music people, as well as Jewish Yiddish language ones. And it's this combination of creativity and violence that I think goes to the heart of Leib Kvitko's early poetry, as well as to the whole Kulturliga endeavor and its network of contacts. I mean, if the sun shines on the world again and COVID ends and we're allowed to go back to archives and I work harder on Ukrainian, I would love to pursue more of these networks. I would love to find out more, because I think we tend to put people in silos. This is Ukrainian, this is Yiddish, or this is Yiddish and this is German, or this is Russian. But real actors, writers, artists, theater directors, they didn't work that way. They talked to one another. They translated one another. They exchanged ideas with one another. And that kind of ephemeral interaction that maybe didn't leave such a big paper trail is one that I think scholars are finally turning to now, and is so important. And just to answer the first question briefly, Kvitko is, I think, one of these people who was born with a sense that there was a hole in his world, H-O-L-E, not W-H-O-L-E, that there was something missing, and that he lost parents at a very early age, but that happened to a lot of people. He lost all relatives at a very early age. He started working at terrible jobs at a very, very early age, and he made this hardship part of how he experienced the world. The world is a wild place. The world is full of grotesque figures who want to harm me. I'm alone in this world. I've been abandoned by the world. And then he took that sort of literary biography that he created about himself, and he inserted into his experience of the pogrom in Uman, about which he writes in his collection of poetry dedicated to those events called 1919. So he's a particularly, and then he went on to write sunny, happy Soviet childhood poetry, and he became very well known and translated into Russian, Ukrainian, many other languages as a children's poet who wrote about the happy world that we now live under, brought to us by Stalin. So he's a really fascinating figure, and there's more than one essay in our volume about him.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Esvik, I think that this would be a good point for you perhaps to comment, because from what I understand, one of your essays looks at Yiddish culture under surveillance. And it says the literary group construction in Soviet Ukraine. And I'm wondering if you could maybe pick up on this subject of then what we see, maybe the Sovietization, because at some point, Kультур-ліг is taken over. It doesn't seem to be flourishing in the way that it had flourished. And I mean, there's a story, it ends up moving to Moscow, and then but it seems that the principal literary figures who are most active in Moscow are actually from Kyiv. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps pick up on this subject and take us how Kультур-ліг, how it develops further, and this sort of the Soviet umbrella in terms of the organization as it moves on.
Yes, exactly. The Kультур-ліг, I'm saying it in English, the Kультур-ліг, its ideas and its people actually dominated the Soviet Yiddish cultural scene till the very end. I started being professionally involved in 1988, and I still could feel some influence or remnants of the influence, and some people were still around, very old people by that time, who were somehow linked with the Kультур-ліг. Now we will have a very unusual source of information about Yiddish and in general Soviet literary life. It's the archives of this NKVD, KGB, and various, incarnations of the Soviet Secret Service. And Kyiv is now, once again, a very interesting place because it has an extremely rich archive. And not only it has an extremely rich archive, it's accessible. Well, what is really important, it's accessible. And now quite a few scholars, including myself, actually, we read endless pages of various cases. And what we find, and we had no idea about it, that actually it's a peculiar and, of course, very biased, to put it mildly biased, more than biased, history of pages in history of literary life, because many writers were actually watched, surveilled. And also what was really, when they would be arrested, they would be created a literary commission, almost always, a literary commission, that other writers and other literary specialists would analyze their writings. And then the writer could send a piece of or a report that rejected some accusations, and once again there would be accusations. So it is a kind of a literary process, a very horrible literary process, but that is documented. And given the fact that we know very little about Yiddish literary life. We know there published poems, there published novels and so on, but their insights, because there are only a handful of memoirs written. Usually people didn't survive, to write memoirs, so we're afraid to write memoirs. So we have this source of information. And really, the ideas of the Kulturligi, they, as I mentioned before, they continued to dominate in various forms during the entire Soviet period. And actually returning to what Harriet just mentioned and discussed, the paradox is that the most intensive cooperation with Ukrainian writers took place during the Soviet period. Took place because they belonged to the same writers' union. They were in the same framework. It was the same writers' union. People who belonged to the Communist Party were members of the same party cell. They participated in the same meetings. They would be elected into same governing boards. They also actually were neighbors, because first in Kharkiv, there was built in the late 1920s an apartment building for writers. Then a similar building was built in 1934, and later it was developed in Kyiv. That still exists, and it is historically known as Rolit, Робітник літератури. Yes. So they were Leib Kvitko and Pavlo Ticina lived in the same apartment. Ticina took lessons of Yiddish, and his teacher was same teacher. So that Kvitko was arrested, and as we know, he was executed in August 1952. He helped his family, his wife, in a way in which it was possible and not very dangerous to help. And we find many examples of cooperation. We find many examples when people couldn't stand each other, not because one of them was Ukrainian and another one was Jew, but quite often, in the literary circles, being just neighbors. Yeah, or sometimes his wife became someone's wife. Yeah, so it or the other way around. So it was just human relations. But the cooperation, it is still a heavily under-researched field. Mm-hmm. And more efforts are needed actually to continue this research. And we find some information about cooperation in general, about the climate, also in the files that are now accessible. Because every time a literary commission, quite often in the literary commission, they would invite also a Ukrainian writer. Quite often they would interrogate neighbors who were Ukrainian writers and so on and so forth. So it was one apartment building, essentially. Not literally, but it was one apartment building. The literary life in Ukraine. And also writers who started their literary life in Ukraine and later lived in Moscow or elsewhere, or in Birobidzhan, for example. And also, let's not forget that for a long period of time, a relatively long period of time, Kharkiv was an important literary center. During the period of time when Kharkiv, until 1934, was the capital of Soviet Ukraine, many writers settled in Kharkiv because this was the place for publishing. It was a place, quite often it was the same publishing house that produced literature in Yiddish and in Ukrainian and Russian.
Dr. Shkandrey, I'm wondering if we look at the aspect of the graphic arts or painting, do you find that same sort of cooperation or that same sort of phenomenon between Ukrainian and Jewish painters, or is that something that is more within the literary field?
No, it was in all fields. Both Harriet and Gennady have mentioned aspects of it, but it began almost immediately after the revolution, when young people flocked to Kiev, particularly Jews who were looking to start a career. And the studio of Alexandra Exter became the focal point for many. So I don't know, a huge number, nobody's really researched this, but a huge number of her students were actually of Jewish origin, and went on to have brilliant careers in Moscow, in New York, in Berlin. A whole school came out of her studio. And at the same time, Bronislava Nijinsky was teaching dance, modern dance. She went on to a brilliant career in Paris. A lot of the people around these individuals were both of Jewish and Ukrainian and of other origins. So it began almost immediately, and it continued. It continued in the theater and music, particularly in performing arts, where there was a mixture of individuals. It should also be mentioned, I mean, the word paradox has come up. This was a paradoxical time. On the one hand, people were drawn to Kiev. There was a push-pull going on. On the one hand, people were drawn to Kiev because it was a way of developing a career. But at the same time, there was a revolution going on, and the pogroms had begun in small towns, villages. So quite a lot of Jews moved to Kiev to escape the pogroms. And not only Jews, I mean, other people as well. So there was this kind of strange phenomena where excitement and opportunity mixed with fear and the desire to escape the horrors elsewhere, including hunger. And so there's a particularly sort of atmosphere about Kiev in those early years. And in the mid-20s, all sorts of organizations were created. There was a policy called indigenization or Ukrainianization. If you take the Ukrainian view of korenizatsiya, indigenization. And this allowed both Jewish institutions and Ukrainian institutions to develop. So, schools, university courses, institutes, cultural institutes, archives, they were developed both by the Jewish community and by the Ukrainian community. And that's one other, in scholarship, that's just another aspect of the interaction and cooperation between these two groups. So it's a very complicated time. It's a hard time to analyze. It's full of contradictions, but the reality was quite strong interaction until the late 20s.
And then, I mean, we sort of, in a way, for me, that there's a certain sorrow, I think, as I was reading the introduction to this volume about, it seems that things just, they changed. And I'm wondering what really brought about sort of the end of the Kультур-ліг. I mean, were these events? Was it an attitude? Was it, people seeing things in too different of a way?
Perhaps Gennady would be the best person to talk about this, but my overview of this is that Stalin took over, and the attacks began on both Jewish activists and Ukrainian activists. They were called they were accused of nationalism. In the Jewish case, Zionism. I mean, these attacks had begun earlier, but the waves of attack became much more intense. You had mass arrests, you had show trials already in the late 20s, and there was great fear that the party would lose control of Ukraine. So that is when the screws began to be tightened in a serious way. And many of these organizations that I mentioned in scholarship, in literature, in the arts, were liquidated, were stopped, were prevented from developing. So I call it the second Stalinist revolution. It was a different world after Stalin took over, and his revolution was, in my view of things, a counter-revolution. It was a bringing to an end of the revolutionary developments, the great hopes for not just a national renaissance in Jewish life, in Ukrainian life, but of greater democratization, of a greater, an openness to the communities and their ability to develop.
Would either, Dr. Esfek, Dr. Murab, would either one of you want to comment on this sort of the we'll call the end of Kультур-ліги?
It depends what we call the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because strictly speaking, institutions with the title Культур-ліги existed until 1931, more or less, in different forms. For example, the publishing house under this title existed in Kiev until 1931. And there were other institutions. And some institutions survived under a different name. Say, the Central Jewish Library survived until the beginning of the war. Yes, so there were schools, the whole network of schools, and to a significant degree, Yiddish schools, Yiddish language schools in Ukraine were developed during the Soviet period on the basis of the schools initially established during the time of the Kультур-ліги. Yes, so they existed also until 1938. But Yaroslav is, of course, right that it was a different climate. It was a different state. In 1918, a writer in Kharkiv, a Yiddish writer, he published it under the byline and Yakov. His real name was Kalman Zingman, wrote a utopian novel. A utopian novel that was, as a literary piece, was horrible, but as a reflection of the dreams, it is very interesting. There is a Jewish phrase that says that the Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. Yes, so they somehow were, the realists believing in miracles. And he imagined the future of Ukraine as a community of a few communities: Jewish, Ukrainian, Polish. A university named after Mickiewicz, a university named after Shevchenko, a university named after Yitzhak Leibush Peretz, the Yiddish classical writer. And so they believed that it was possible. It was possible to create, because the idea of the Kультур-ліги, it was nation building, and similar ideas were very common among the Ukrainian counterparts. And initially, in the 1920s, it was possible, to have these ideas, to express such ideas, and to try to develop them and to find solutions in the Soviet Union. But in the 30s, it became impossible. So de facto, the ideas of the Kультур-ліги, the ideas of this nation building, were doomed. That they couldn't, there was no continuation. So effectively, the whole ideology it could survive. It could survive in various forms in the circle of Yiddish writers, in the circle of Yiddish artists, and so on. But any expressions, public expressions or literary expression, became impossible. So it was the end. It was the end, and the end really by the end of the 1920s.
Dr. Murab, yes, I
just want to gesture to a somewhat broader picture. You know, in thinking about Kультур-ліга, school, children's houses, and libraries, which were very impressive, which I've read documents by contemporary officials who are hostile to Kультур-ліга, who had to confess that if not for Kультур-ліga, there would not be X number of libraries in Stettlach. They had established libraries. And I'm also thinking about adult education, which was a big factor, courses, you know, in Kiev and Paris and elsewhere. And I'm thinking even of Franz Rosenzweig's idea of the Lehrhaus, the kind of reading circle and reading study center for adults. In the United States, there's a huge movement called Jewish community centers. Yes, they have a swimming pool and a gym, but their basic function was to provide adult education. And this, even the fundamental idea that secularizing, assimilating Jews need to have access to high culture, I can attest to this from my childhood. My father's an immigrant from a shtetl in Poland, and on the shelves in our living room are the modern library editions of the great writers, you know, so Dostoevsky and so on and so forth. So this whole notion, as Gennady was saying, that instead of religion, we're going to have high culture and it's going to make us people like other people, is very powerful and it has not ended. It has not ended. What do you do when you don't know what to do anymore? Take a course. Take a course. This is, I think, part of Kультур-ліга ideology that survived, merged with other similar movements from other Jewish centers in the world, including Berlin. So it's transformed. No, we don't have the same figures. Yes, they were murdered by Stalin, but continuing education, adult education, high culture will save us. This is a pretty powerful idea in the Jewish community to this day.
And I'm wondering, because we will need to wrap up in a minute, but I'm wondering, can we say that within the Ukrainian community, that there was a similar type of organization? And this could be a whole different other topic, but let's say if for the Ukrainian diaspora and Ukrainians, is there an analog for Ukrainians?
Well, I can answer that, I think. Definitely. The whole idea was, throughout the 19th century, was for Ukrainians to get an education, to become literate. They developed these reading societies called prosvitas, which flourished in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. There was a push for literacy immediately after the revolution. All these things were very much part of the climate at the time. I think it might also, to go back to your initial question, why Kiev? It might also be worth mentioning that Kiev was, in fact, a multicultural city, a multicultural town. It was not primarily Ukrainian, until quite a few years after the revolution. There were communities of different groups who, as Gennady pointed out, interacted. These people were all excited by change, by education, by transformation. That was the word in the air. They used Renaissance revival, but transformation was what it's all about. And that always began with education. It always began with developing your population.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I wanted to thank the three of you for taking the time to discuss, I think, this very important movement, which still lives in many ways, even though maybe not in that name. So I invite everybody to also visit our website, ukrainianjewishencounter.org, where this video will be posted and you can watch it later on. So thank you very much.